Right, shall we make a start? So welcome everybody to the second Contemporary South Asia seminar of the term. My name is David Gelman, in case you don't know me. I'm a professor of social anthropology. Yeah, please do come in. There's plenty of seats. In fact, sit at the back. Today's subject is particularly interesting for me because as a Nepal specialist, I'm very conscious of the fact that the nation state in South Asia is extremely young, and South Asia is a kind of natural experiment, if you like, in the effects of the nation state on culture, which starts the same but maybe led in different directions by different states. And in my own work, one of the statements that's been very influential was the great French Sanskritist and historian who wrote the history of Nepal back in 1905, and he knew, he was very knowledgeable about the whole of South Asia and actually Asia as a whole. And he wrote this kind of much repeated, much cited epigram that Sri Lanka is, or Ceylon, of course, as we called it then, is South Asia deviated 2,000 years ago. Kashmir is India, South Asia itself. In other words, it's been through all the stages of South Asian history. Nepal is India in the making. Nepal is, if you want to see what medieval India was like, pre-Islamic India, then you have to go to the Kamandi Valley, which is what he meant. So today's talk is very much, I think, in that comparative, the title anyway. We have Pakistan and India, common origins, divergent trajectories, and it's based on Pervez's new book, which we have 4 copies here. For those of you who would like to buy one, unfortunately it's £40, but if you've got £40 in cash and haven't been, you're welcome to take one home with you. And Pervez's amazing kind of, I suppose, perhaps you only find this in South Asia nowadays, Renaissance man. He's had 2 careers. He did his PhD in physics in MIT. He's a very distinguished scientist in Pakistan, but he's also kind of extremely well-known public intellectual, which is in itself quite a brave thing to be these days in South Asia. And if you look at the list of luminaries who've endorsed this book, it just shows you how distinguished and how well connected he is. So we start with Noam Chomsky, Francis Robinson, Tariq Rahman, Rajmohan Gandhi, Yeshi Siddiqua, Philip Oldenburg, and finishing with our own Faisal Devji. So without further ado, hand over to Pervez.
Thank you, Professor Gelder. And thank you for setting out the theoretical background, the framework for this. You all know that Pakistan today is reported almost exclusively in terms of the crises that it's enduring. It has had to go to the IMF now for the 21st time. It is desperately seeking funds to survive the next few months from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, from elsewhere. Politically, it is in turmoil. Its economy relies principally on unskilled labor exported to the Middle East, as well as the export of textiles, which is not a very high technology item. And on the other hand, we see that India is doing rather well for itself materially. It has now exports in high technology fields, software, computers, pharmaceuticals. It's got a space program that now is a rather advanced one, being one of the few countries that has spacecraft circling Mars. Recently, it sent a spacecraft to the moon and sent a lander on that. Now, there is an enormous gap that separates the 2 countries now, but this wasn't always there. 1947, the difference wasn't all that great. In fact, Pakistan's economy was in the 1960s growing faster than that of India. Its space program preceded India's. In fact, the first sounding rockets were launched in 1962 or 63. And that was before ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, was formed. So what is it that has happened, and how can we trace its historical roots? For this, I think one should not go back just to 1947. One needs to go back far into the past. Well, where does Pakistan record its beginnings from? Ask any Pakistani kid, and what he's learned there is that Pakistan was not made in 1947. It was made in 712 AD, when the first Muslim conqueror, Muhammad bin Qasim, landed in Sindh, and that's when it all began. Of course, it's complete nonsense, but that's what kids are taught in our schools. But let me talk a little bit about the title of this talk, Common Origins. Okay, so 712, let's keep that in mind. And this is about 70 years after the death of the Holy Prophet, Prophet Muhammad. About 300 years after that comes Al-Biruni. Here is a scholar, a man who's a traveler, who's very interested in knowing about the world around him, and he comes with another conqueror, this time a serious plunderer, Mahmud Ghaznavi, Sultan Muhammad Mahmud Ghaznavi. But Biruni is not interested in going around with the Sultan. He's interested in learning Sanskrit. He's interested in learning about what's around him. And he spends 13 years of his life learning Sanskrit and learning what the ancients have in their books, the Brahmins principally. He looks at the people over there, and although by now there is a substantial Muslim population, people who look like me and several others in the audience, he doesn't regard them as Muslims. Instead, he identifies someone as Iranian, somebody as Afghan, somebody as Turk, somebody as coming from Central Asia. The rest, people like me and many in the audience, he calls them Hindus. He doesn't differentiate between those who recite the Kalma and those who go to the temples. He calls them all Hindus. Why? Because they're people from Al-Hind. Now, Al-Hind comes from Sindh. Sindh is a word, I don't know where that came from, but it's linked with the river, the Indus. It's called Sindhu Darya. And so he says, they're all Hindus. Now, that was the level at which people were actually at in those days. There was an enormous amount of syncretism. There was, there were shrines at which both Hindus and Muslims worshiped. There was the Bhakti movement, which lasted for several centuries. And I'm skipping over a lot of history. And if you want details, this is the first part of my book. There are 5 parts. You had, even up till the time of the Mughals, that the Mughals in their courts had Hindus almost in equal numbers. And in fact, the generals that the Mughals employed were often Hindus. Furthermore, they married into Hindus. They married the Rajputs. In fact, no Mughal emperor is born of a Muslim woman. It's they have, somebody has actually calculated the various percentages, which go from 1 in 4 to 1 in 12, something like that. It becomes more and more marriages, cross marriages, and so the purity is entirely lost. At this point, you could say that although there were wars between the Mughals, Shivaji in South India. Nevertheless, there was a degree of uniformity, of being able to live together, and not always was it comfortable, particularly when there was very religious Mughal emperor on the throne, and that was at the time of Aurangzeb. So we have two poles. One is that of Akbar the Great, Akbar-e-Azam, as he's called, who believed in syncretism, who in fact tried to start his own religion called Deen-e-Ilahi, and in fact tried to incorporate Christianity and Buddhism in that as well. And he did that for pragmatic reasons, because if you have to rule over such a large part of India, you can't make religious enemies. So that was the time when the Mughal Empire spread, was the most powerful, the most inclusive. The decline of the Mughal Empire comes about with Aurangzeb, and that's something like 100 years later. And that's when the insistence was on purity of belief. This was also the time when Muslim purifiers, so purifiers of Islam, gained strength, like Shah Waliullah. So these are common origins, but now the common origins start to diverge. And remember that our ultimate goal is to understand why partition came about and why the two-nation theory gained currency. And that, in fact, is the thread that runs through my book. While ruling India, the Mughals were people who enjoyed hunting, looking after their lands. They liked poetry, singing, dancing, all that. They weren't interested in intellectual pursuits. They left business, finance, accounting, all to Hindus, and they thought that this is not a very decent thing for a Muslim to do. So, yeah, they did learn Arabic and Persian, and Urdu was developing at that time. But in the courts, there was not much discussion, not much curiosity about the world around them. In fact, this is the time of the European Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. And the ambassador, the English ambassador comes, and he presents various scientific gadgets to the court of Emperor Jahangir. And everybody, of course, very, very interested in the spectacles that he's brought. So he brought big chests filled with all these gadgets. There was a telescope. Now, the telescope had inspired a lot of curiosity in Europe. But here, in the courts, well, people took a peek here, a peek there. Yeah, great. But they didn't try and understand what made it work. They didn't try to duplicate it. And so now I'm going to skip a large fraction of that history and come to the coming of the British. So the British bring with them the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of the scientific revolution. Of course, they came initially to trade and then to rule. The British East India Company makes its way into India. Initially, it is just to trade goods, but then they gain more and more influence. They didn't fight any big wars except for two, and they were not huge wars. But in time, they took over all of India. Now, at no time were there more than 50,000 of them, and they knew that in order to rule such a big subcontinent, they would need support. They would need administrative support from an educated class over there. And so this is around the time of 1835. Lord Macaulay comes up with his educational reform. And this basically says that the pathshalas, the gurukuls, the maktabs, and the madrasas, and these are the traditional educational institutions for Hindus and for Muslims respectively. He says, we're not going to fund them. We're going to fund schools where they teach science, English, math, geography, the stuff that is going to be helpful to us for ruling India. Here is where I think the beginnings of the two nations is. That's the real starting point. You know, in history, you can't locate any one point, but I think this was extremely significant because of the very different reactions from the Hindu and the Muslim communities. So the Hindus were, there was a strong reaction against it, but in only certain parts. However, a ground had been prepared for adjustment to modernity. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Brahmo Samaj, and other people like that had put their weight behind it. And so there was grudging acceptance at the beginning, but later on, more and more. And they said, okay, you British, you better give us more schools, more colleges, universities. And so they took off in a certain direction. But Muslims had, by and large, a very different reaction. And this reaction was exemplified by the protest that the ulema made in Bengal soon after 1835, I think just in the months after the Macaulay reforms were announced, in which 8,000 and some 800 mullahs, ulema, they wrote in protest at this and said, we don't want your education, keep it. We have our book, which has got divine guidance and which is better than anything that you can teach us. And so, no, thank you. Well, that was maybe not so clearly expressed by other Muslims across India, but it was expressed well enough. There was resistance to that learning. And there are only a few instances where this was resisted and where there was a different outcome. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, he was a Muslim reformer, like the Brahmo Samaj, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy. But you see, there were many others among the Hindus. Among Muslims, he was the only one. And by the way, one of my chapters is about him. And it turns out that he's a very interesting character, extremely interesting character, about whom everything is hidden except for one thing, that he's the one who invented the two-nation theory. Well, he sort of did, but not in the sense that it is understood in Pakistan today. Also, what is hidden from public view is that he was a radical reformer of Muslim theology. In fact, to an extent that nobody else anywhere in the world, including Egypt, including Turkey, has gone so far as this man did. But all that is hidden from the Pakistani public. So that's why actually I had to write this book, because there are so many things that are hidden from our people that an honest version of history had to be written. Anyway, to continue on what I was saying. So the educational gap between Hindus and Muslims widened. If you look at the statistics in this book, they're absolutely appalling. The University of Calcutta, which was the first university established by the British on the subcontinent, and this was in 1856. It had several hundred Hindu applicants, and it had just a handful of Muslim applicants. And when the first graduating class emerged, it was a few hundred Hindus who had graduated and just 2 Muslims, just 2. And if you consider the size of the Muslim population then, well, it wasn't 2 to 100 or several hundred. It was like more like 1:3 or 1:4. I don't know exactly how much. So then the question is, why were the Muslims resisting modern knowledge, science, math, and so forth, when in fact it was the Muslims who were the only ones doing physics and math and science and astronomy and medicine from the 9th through the 13th centuries. And that was the golden age of Muslim science. And why did that percolate here onto the Indian subcontinent? Well, there are several hypotheses that one can give over here. First, the period of the flowering of Muslim science, of the Muslim golden age, that was inspired by Greek learning. And so if one looks at the rise of Muslim learning, it happens 150 years after the death of the Prophet. And it happens in Baghdad, and it happens through the translation of Greek works into Arabic. Now, the translation was the first part. Most of the translators were not Muslims. But gradually, the translators also were more and more Muslim. And then the Muslims, they started making genuine new contributions. And this was actually possible because in the courts of the caliphs, people like Caliph Al-Mamun, Abdul Rahman, Harun al-Rashid, etc. You had Jews, you had Christians, you had Muslims all working together. And it is through that intellectual ferment that new ideas were generated. And this lasted a long time, 4 centuries. Well, you could argue 4 centuries plus or minus half a century, but still a very long time. And then why did it die out? Well, you know, this is well-traveled ground. Everyone has their theories on it, but what I see, and I think it's pretty clear why it happened. It happened because of the resurgence of the orthodoxy. The mullah triumphed over the scholar. The mullah triumphed over the businessman, over the traveler, over merchants. So you see, Arab merchants in those days used to go all around the world, and they're very adept at this, and they brought back new ideas, new knowledge, and they were very highly sought after by the caliphs. But then the caliphs started looking for legitimacy, and who could provide legitimacy better than a mullah, than the clerics? If your rule is sanctioned by God, then you are firm. And so the mullah displaced all the others and became the most important element of the court. And so this continued on. What one sees in the 3 empires that were more or less at the same time, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavids, and the Mughals, was that they had strong components of the clerics surrounding the ruler. And consequently, there was less new idea and less intellectual ferment over there. And that, to me, explains why it all went down in Islamic civilization in general. But then this had serious consequences for what would happen to the future of India. So comes the 20th century, and the 20th century now sees political movements emerge because the British are going to be leaving pretty soon. This was clear. Oh, can I have some water? It was no rush, but fine, anytime that you can find it. It was, even before the First World War, it was pretty clear that the British would not be able to rule a continent which is so big. And it became obvious when the Second World War started. Now, this is the time when the existing differences could be leveraged. Thank you. And they were leveraged very effectively by two different leaders, sets of leaders. One was Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League. But then the other was M.S. Golwalkar and Veer Savarkar, who really are the ideologues of Hindutva today. And they argued for there being two separate nations which could never live together in peace. Okay, since I've posed the question and I've sort of answered, I'm going to wrap up with a summary. So comes 1947, you see that the Hindus are vastly more educated than the Muslims. In fact, you see a Nobel Prize being awarded to C.V. Raman, and I think this is 1920 something. You hear of names like Saha and so many others, the quantum physicists. Among Muslims, there were some, but very few educated people. So comes partition. What happens is that Pakistan inherits just one university, which was Punjab University in Lahore, and most of its good teachers, professors were Hindus who then fled to India. Subsequently, those positions were filled up, those academic positions were filled up by those who really weren't very competent. But anyway, they took those positions. The number of universities multiplied, and it is constantly multiplying. We have 300 today. Unfortunately, they produce very little because unless you have an academic tradition, it doesn't matter how many buildings you build or how many labs you make. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia. It's got all the resources in the world. It's got the most, it's got the biggest buildings. It imports faculty from the United States, from the UK, everywhere, and yet they haven't managed to produce very much in terms of academics, in terms of science. I could say the same for much of the other Arab countries as well. So, in a nutshell, in a world that is defined by knowledge, India has hugely outpaced Pakistan. That doesn't make India any kind of an ideal. It is way, way behind China, way, way behind Europe. Unfortunately, that has given India a hubris that gives it the right to be a civilizational state, to say that it was the superiority of our faith, of our culture, which has enabled us to get this far. That's not really true, because if you look at other countries, if you look at South Korea, if you look at Vietnam, and Vietnam is such a great example of this, because here's a country that was nearly bombed back to the Stone Age by the Americans, but which today produces mathematics students which are better than Americans. And the Americans are afraid of the Chinese. The Chinese are afraid of the Vietnamese. We humans are all endowed with similar qualities. It's only that some political systems, some cultures don't allow those qualities to be manifest or to be developed. What I'm hoping is that at some point, Pakistan, but more generally the Muslim world, will realize that shutting itself out to the rest of the world is a bad idea, a really bad idea, not just because you lose out on ideas in anthropology or history or mathematics, but because you lose out then politically. You lose out in terms of economic power, because this is a world that is built on knowledge. Knowledge equals power. I guess I've said enough. Thank you very much for listening to me. I know what I've said is going to rile up some people, but you know, we've got to face the truth at some point. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm sure there will be lots of questions from people are gathering their thoughts. Let me just ask you about, go back to the kind of 18th century, 17th, 18th century, when you were talking about comparison. I mean, one of the factors that's been put forward as lying behind the so-called European miracle is the simple political fact that Europe was divided into lots of relatively small countries by South Asian standards, and kind of interstate competition, kind of post-peace Westphalia, was kind of built in, if you like. And so, you know, whichever state was was not open in your terms, was not open to minorities, was not open to knowledge. It became very clear that they were losing out on science. That meant they were also losing out politically in terms of competition between states. So that simple fact of having, unlike China, unlike South Asia, being divided into these states with relatively secure boundaries where, you know, minorities could move, that in itself generated a kind of virtuous circle of competition, if you like, both economically but also in terms of knowledge.
Well, wasn't secularization essential to that? The fact that the 100 Years' War, 30 Years' War had to be fought before people could have countries that were secular, and then, well, breaking the power of the Christian church was critical to the development of science. We know that from multiple sources. After all, the Galileo episode is so striking, where he was sentenced to death for his advocacy of the geocentric theory. In terms of dividing up Europe into states with definite boundaries, I suppose that could have been important in economic terms, but in terms of how ideas get transmitted across, how could that be an important factor? I am not clear about that.
Yes.
There's the lady over there.
Identify yourself so our speaker knows who he's speaking to.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Fahad. I am from Aligarh, and today is the birth anniversary of Sasid Ahmad Khan.
Good.
I was wondering, in present day India, for example, how, and of course, a lot of what you're saying is also then appropriated by the Hindu right in India to attack places such as Aligarh, to attack the Muslims there. How do you think those political waters can be negotiated with that sort of a history behind? For example, Sasid Ahmad Khan's role, etc., whatever you talk about.
So if you look at Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's role, he was a person for Hindu-Muslim unity. In fact, he is famous for saying that Hindus and Muslims are like two eyes of a bride without one, the other is, without both, you're ugly. He was also one who was very defensive of the interests of the elite, both Muslim and Hindu. In fact, he despised the common man, both Hindu and Muslim. That was the commonality that he brought between them. Okay, your question, how do you negotiate your history? And I say that I'm not guilty of what my great-grandfather did. I didn't even know him. I don't even know the name of my, one through 2 generations before me, 3 generations before me. Why should I be held responsible for that? So you've got to say, look, I'm a citizen of the state. The Constitution gives me equal rights, and this is what I will insist upon. I don't care what my forefathers did. And in fact, that's the way for any plural entity to exist. We, wherever we came from, is unknown to us. Yes, madam. Yes.
I didn't read it, I'd like you to elaborate if you have this. Now you said mullahs gained prominence and this is the reason behind all this turmoil. Isn't the mullahs became important by the political pressure, like their ties to political rulers made them prominent in the court? So it is a process of political interest. In that sense, there's something economic behind it. And also this also leaves the other scholars vulnerable because they are dependent on some capital from the government, potentially. So did you talk about the freedom of thought and how their lack of funding maybe contributed to scholars' good interest? So there's a lot of political violence. This is one question. And the other thing is, even if that is so, we see religious persecution in all history, in Europe, in other parts historically. But the sciences didn't stop there, so it continued to grow. So there must be some other explanations.
So let me, in answer to your question, let me give you a bird's eye view of how how Greek thought affected Muslim thinking in the 9th century. And this thought was basically Aristotelian logic, which inspired the idea that Islam could be thought of not just as a faith, but also as a faith based upon logic, upon reason. And so this gave rise to the Mu'tazila movement. This movement insisted that Allah has given humans sufficient capability to understand the world and to change it. And so they moved away from the concept of predestiny and said that we have agency, we have will. This position brought it into conflict with the traditional cleric. And the conflict lasted several centuries, but it was always the Mu'tazila, because they had political power, that they were able to suppress the traditional cleric, people like Imam Ibn Hanbal. Now, in the process, because the caliphs wanted absolute power, they committed many, many wrongs. They did, for example, Imam Hanbal was subjected to torture. Eventually, the Mu'tazila lost their credibility there, and they were then taken over by the other side, the Ash'aris. Okay, you can say it is political, but behind that was an ideology that lost out, and lost out for pretty much ever. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who we talked about, he tried to revive the Mu'tazila ideology, but he was not successful at it. In fact, remarkably, he had to ban his own books in his own university.
When reading for the Amphil in modern South Asian studies, there's a old theological dispute as to whether God's reason or God's will is primary. One of the reasons that's advanced for why Islam loses out vis-a-vis science is that there's a radical voluntarist position holding that it's the will that's primary over God's reason. Do you think that there are internal principles within Islam, some way that it can be reconstituted or rearticulated? This is really what my book is about. How do you come down?
So this is exactly what I was talking about in different words. If you say that God is primary and that everything happens with his will, then it's God's, is it God's will that this falls? Well, yeah. So I have to say, inshallah. The minute you say, inshallah, you say, if God wills, this will fall down. Okay, you're in a hospital, you're getting treated for some whatever. Now, will you be cured? Well, it depends upon the medicines you're given and the kind of care you're given. Does it depend on whether God wants it? I'd say it's pretty much the same thing. It'll fall no matter what. Now, if you make God primary, then you destroy science. And that's what's happened. And if your question is, can this ever change? Yeah, I think it can. I think it can. I think that a growing and large number, is not yet a majority, but a growing number of Muslims would just like to leave such questions aside. They're pragmatic. They know that, for example, you know, there's this famous preacher. His name is Tariq Jamil. And he says that the cure for everything is this khajur. Khajur, what is khajur? Date, yeah. And it's called Ajwa khajur. Ajwa is a place in Saudi Arabia. And if you have any disease, you pop a few Ajwa khajurs and you'll be fixed. Okay, he preaches this on television. And yet just last year, he had some palpitations in his heart and he went to a hospital and he had a stent put in. And that's telling you that he doesn't believe in Ajwa Khajur. He doesn't believe in the primacy of God. He believes in Western medicine. So that's the kind of pragmatism that's inevitably going to force itself onto thinking people. Yeah. Yes, yes.
So I thought it was really interesting. Thank you for your talk. I thought it was really interesting how you began with a reference to the current space mission that India.
Speak a bit louder.
I thought it was interesting that you began your talk with a reference to the Chandrayaan mission that India just completed the space mission. Because I read quite a bit around it, and there was quite a few in-depth reports focusing on the faulty nature of the science, the way in which it was either oversimplistic or lifted wholesale from previous space missions. So I think that that points to an interesting kind of larger issue that I was wondering what your take was on, which is that to what extent do you think India sort of benefits from the constant twin nature of its relationship to Pakistan, and particularly that projection of the self-projection of India as a sort of enlightened, forward-thinking society as compared to Pakistan, and the ways in which those ideas are weaponized, for example, by the current government, which obviously also has a kind of religious connotation to it, it being a Hindu government. So I was just wondering what you thought about that.
So far as I can understand, the Indian government and the Indian public now pretty much feels that Pakistan has no more than nuisance value, that it's been put in place, that there's such a high degree of euphoria in India with the growing economy, Chandrayaan-3, and now the solar mission, that they don't feel they have to worry about Pakistan anymore. Now, unfortunately, what this has done in terms of its internal dynamics is it has given Narendra Modi and the BJP sanction for doing whatever they want with the Muslim minority over there, and to an extent with the Christians as well. If your question was, what do they feel about Pakistan? They feel Pakistan is now irrelevant, except for one thing. It's got nukes. And those nukes on both sides are enough to annihilate the other, and there's no way of stopping them. Maybe you can stop half of them, but half of them will get through. Did I answer your question in full, or was there something left over? Okay, thank you.
Follow-up question to that. Last week, we had a fascinating talk about, it was about microethnography of middle-class young men in Delhi. And one of the things which came out in the question period was that these young Hindu middle-class men in Delhi, who are kind of performing modernity in various complex ways, and it was implied very, very much BJP supporters, they're obsessed with Pakistan. Whereas young men in the same, just over the border in Lahore, young Pakistani men are not obsessed by India. That was the claim put forward. Why this asymmetry? So you're saying the government doesn't care about Pakistan anymore, but the ethnographer of youth in Delhi says, yes, these young men are in everyday life, they are obsessed with Pakistan and what it's doing.
You know, I'm very intrigued by your comment, which comes from this talk that you listened to, and it sets me thinking, because whatever is written about Pakistan, the majority of, okay, not written, but let me tell you a little bit, I need a bit of background. So I started an institution in Islamabad called the Black Hole. The Black Hole has lectures every day on something that's got to do with science, art, culture, one of the three. And these are put on YouTube, and 70% of the comments come from India. I'm wondering why on earth are Indians so worried about Pakistan. And on the other hand, if you look at those who are commenting on Indian programs, on programs produced in India, very few Pakistanis are doing that. So I am intrigued by what you say, and it's true.
There's been a lot of recent scholarship and thinking, particularly of Audrey Rushdie, on Aurangzeb, and complicating and nuancing this discourse around him as being this Orthodox Muslim ruler, and really seeking to, through various sources, understand how actually he does not embody that ruler, right? That more often than not, you saw far more Hindu officials and high-ranking officers in his sort of empire, and you saw him, yes, destroying Hindu temples, but destroying and putting bans on even Eid festivals, right? So in some sense, I guess my question is, what does it serve us to project this binary of Hindu and Muslim back into history, right? Because that history, in some sense, if you look beyond this very binary lens, you see that actually reveals something about how kingship was being constructed, rather than Muslim versus Hindu again. And if you are tracing this history, does it not serve to reify these categories and cause more division in our present post-colonial state?
Well, thank you for that comment. You're absolutely right. First of all, I will not move back from my comment that Aurangzeb was as nasty a character as you could get. He blinded his father. He killed his brothers. Dara Shikoh, he had him beheaded. All those things said he was nastier to Shias than he was to Hindus. So kings, emperors were nasty all around much of the time. And if you look at his predecessors, they were far more pluralistic. And in fact, they were criticized bitterly by the clergy of that time. So yes, we should not be looking for binaries. And of course, he's a guy who's being kicked around, I mean, deservedly so. But we need to have a broader view of history and not focus on particular instances, particular characters, because that could be misleading.
Hi, my name is Wafa, and we see like a lot of political scientists and historians see Pakistan and India as like a perfect case for comparison to sort of create these causal arguments, because the idea is that they both have similar colonial legacies. And like, I haven't read your book, but the title like Common Origins, but there's work like Aisha Jalal's that talks about how they were very differential colonial legacies. Like at the time of partition, Pakistan had inherited like a very different legacy than India, like in terms of economics, in terms of like a very highly militarized Punjab, and so on and so forth. So there are like all these very real differences in these legacies that then make it difficult for Pakistan to consolidate democracy, for example, and makes it easier for India to do so. So have you like engaged with that literature and with that work in your book?
Absolutely. The fact is that the Muslim League, apart from Mr. Jinnah himself, was a bunch of landlords, feudals, very few capitalists, traders, businessmen, very few of those. Most of these were predatory landlords who saw their personal interests as being served by partition. In fact, before 1937 in Punjab, where most of the bloodletting happened, it was the Unionist Party that was dominant, and the Unionist Party was linked with the Congress Party. Now, there was a resounding defeat to the Muslim League at that time, and that's the time when Jinnah changed his position and said, now we must have religion and politics go together. Earlier on, he had said that that is ethically, morally wrong. Now he said we've got to link the two together. The landlords who were in the Unionist Party, all the Muslim landlords in the Unionist Party, came over to the Muslim League. And so this is the legacy that Pakistan inherited, and which after partition determined its future trajectory. Once Jinnah died, these landlords, feudals fought amongst themselves. Within a space of 3.5, 4 years, there were 6 prime ministers. The Muslim League just disintegrated, fell to pieces. There was just one force that was modern, that was disciplined, put together by the British, and that was the Pakistan Army. And hence the Praetorian state that we have. So yes, we did have different legacies. Let's also see this from another point of view. Jawaharlal Nehru was a committed socialist. He said that we will do away with feudalism, and he didn't go back on his promise. West Punjab, East Punjab, the Indian part of Punjab, East Punjab, has no feudals now. In fact, it didn't have feudal holdings 2, 3, 4 years after partition. But those holdings persist in Pakistan today because Jinnah never said that we must have land reform. Not once did he say that. All his allies were feudals. By the way, Aisha Jalal never says that. She whitewashes Jinnah.
In the back, yeah.
Question. The former finance minister visited us actually in the Sun.
Can you speak a bit louder? Miftah Ismail, or was it? Okay.
Essentially, there are other sort of power structures that carry more influence. I suppose what I'm trying to understand is when it comes to the issue of land reform specifically, if we were to assume that the military is, for example, capable of passing or influencing legislation in a way that such reforms could take place, given that they are using their influence to force people out of country, is there a reason, is there a vested interest that the military has in ensuring that the current sort of status quo in relation to land laws and etc. Is that, does the military have an interest in perpetuating this, or is it not in its interest also to perhaps reform the current landscape?
It has absolutely no interest in trying to change the status quo. Those in the assembly today, 90% of them are from some feudal family, because those at the time of partition passed their holdings on to their children, who passed it on to their children. So now we are seeing the second generation of feudal elites fully in control of the parliament. As far as the army goes, it is itself a landlord. In fact, it's a very voracious landlord. It is now taking over parts of very fertile land, it already has in places like Okara, and it does so under the excuse of commercial farming. And so they say, we will use scientific farming techniques and invite the Chinese to do the farming for us. The fact is that this is a land-hungry army, and this parliament will never, never allow land reform. Further, and this should clinch it, the Islamic Ideology Council has declared land reform to be un-Islamic, contrary to the teachings of Islam. And the cleric behind it, Maulana Taqi Usmani, it's his imprimatur. Land reform is against Islam.
I'm Alok Rai. I'm from India. One, I think the importance of Pakistan in Indian public life needs to be attended to much more urgently. You know, this irrelevance of Pakistan to start with is not true. Pakistan plays an extremely important part in Indian political life, which is why when recently, it's a comic instance of this, when the Indian Parliament decreed that India would be Bharat, there was some statement that Pakistan would then appropriate the name India for itself, which would of course instantly delegitimize the weapon that is used in Indian political life against any critic of the present regime, go to Pakistan, because then it would mean go to India. However, there is, you know, I think thinking of South Asia in terms of this sort of, you know, either Hindu-Muslim or India-Pakistan binary. I don't really know about Pakistan, but about India, it underrepresents the complexity of it. And one aspect of it certainly is, you know, in fact, the story of Indian science, which, you know, which obviously influences Arab science during the 13th century. There's something that needs to be understood there as well. The death of Indian science, the fact that it develops at a certain time, mathematics and astronomy in particular, and then, which, I mean, I'm sorry, I don't want to carry on, but basically that one cannot actually think about India, either Indian science or Indian political life, or indeed the rise of Hindutva, without actually factoring caste into the equation. Caste is exceedingly important, and Hindutva has to be understood as an upper caste formation. It is a solution, it's a solution to an Indian upper caste problem. But I'm sorry, that I would be interested to know whether your account of South Asia can accommodate that.
My concentration was on Pakistan's identity, how Pakistanis view themselves. How Indians view themselves is much more complex. And I would not attempt to get into territory that I have not fully explored. I am always amazed by how much attention Indians pay towards Pakistan. They don't need to, but somehow they do. I mean, except for our nuclear weapons, what else matters? Kashmir now is that line of control is not going to change. Not in my lifetime, not in yours. And so get on with your life. Get on with your life over here. But really, your question is very important. I wish I could. Yeah.
Thank you for this. I just wanted to build upon what Mr. Raj just said. So, don't you think we still need to be more nuanced in the way that we look at our past? Like, I mean, we started this work by talking about, Biruni and how he was sort of looking at sin or him as this, place of multiple identities in which people were not recognized as Hindu or Muslim, like the way we understand them now. But identities were more regional in their conceptualization. And however, in this very cynical present that we have inherited, we are, the boundaries have become so deeply entrenched that, we can't really conceive of a past that's not sort of consolidated as Hindu or Muslim. And the way that we sort of had this discussion today, it's somewhat seemed to reinforce that, entrenchment of identities. So do you think that there's value in sort of stepping away from this and having more nuanced ways of looking at the past? Isn't that more productive in the present at the very least?
Nuance, certainly, but one must stick to facts. And if one looks at, so we're talking about science, and I keep insisting that the difference between India and Pakistan today is primarily because of the different levels of knowledge, modern knowledge that came to or was acquired by each side. So if one goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, you have a whole bunch of Indian scientists. There's Saha, there's S.N. Bose, there's C.V. Raman, and there's a lot of them. It didn't come out of, and of course Ramanujan, who can forget him? It didn't come out of the Vedas, didn't come out of any Mahabharata or any other book. It came from exercising rational faculties, which was brought by Western civilization, by the British. And they could draw upon it and create new structures. That's what Ramanujan did. He didn't just very, very smart. And although he claimed that his ideas came from above, I don't remember the name of his god. But we know it's not true, because all that mathematics is completely that of the rest of mathematics, of Fourier, of Laplace, of Leibniz, and so forth. So it's the differential amount of modern knowledge that accounts for the difference. Okay, does this reinforce, are we being essentialist? We have to let facts speak for themselves. I mean, I'm completely insistent that we are the same people, but it's just that we are programmed slightly differently. And that programming, that education, has to be redone in a way that emphasizes universalism.
Financial trade say that Pakistan is view themselves as like through a religious sense. But I think that when you sort of move away from religion completely towards science, Pakistan is a state where its welfare state is so sensitive that when you completely move away from that stage, a lot of our welfare needs are accommodated by the informal economy, which mostly relies on religion. For example, like zakat is one of the biggest poverty alleviation methods, especially in rural areas. So do you think that once we completely move away from that, the state can, like, for example, has enough to sort of promise that, you know, once you completely move away from religion, the state can overcome all these barriers that would be put in place? For example, if zakat was to do it.
I would look at it completely differently. I'd say, look, Pakistan is a state where tax evasion is the highest anywhere in the world. And we're not bad people. So we have to justify it somehow, right? How do we justify it? Through zakat, through going for Hajj, through praying 5 times a day and committing every possible crime under the sun. The richest man in Pakistan is a land grabber, but he makes a lot of mosques. He's a very charitable man. And so religion is used to justify crimes against people, evading taxes, breaking the law, going through traffic lights, going the wrong way against the flow of traffic. Everything is justified as long as you go and pray and give zakat. Religion provides the ideal cover.
Put forward a fulsome case for Western science and civilization and for scientific rationalism and how this would be good for Pakistan. But on dominant historiographies of Western civilization through the course of the 20th century, one might say that sort of dream of ever greater equality and ever greater progress sort of broken by the world wars. Actually, it was the rationalization that led to greater nationalism that sort of led to colonialism in the West. I mean, that's sort of Frankfurt School historiographies that say that it's actually this belief in scientific rationality as such that in a way leads to the bloodiness of the 20th century. So when it comes to morality, if you accept that there is a distinction between facts and values, do you think that Islam has something to teach? And if not, where does one find one's morality in a nuclear world?
When you ask me, does Islam have something to teach in terms of values? Well, it depends. You know, there is not one Islam. I don't even think that there are 70 Islams, 72. That's the number of sects. I think there are 1.8 billion Islams because everyone interprets Islam differently. There is no Pope in Islam. So if you believe that Islam teaches you humanism, then good. As far as scientific rationality, reason, logic, enlightenment values, yes, you're absolutely right. This is what also led to the Holocaust. I mean, after all, it was Hitler who was a very rational person in that way. So obviously that's not enough. What you've got to do is add on to this or make it subject to humanism, to the notion that we are all endowed with rights and those should never be violated. And those rights are put down in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And I think that should be the real holy document for the world.
So it's sort of an extension to that question. Over the last decade, as you said, India has seen great scientific progress, particularly in terms of ISRO. On the ground also, you know, they've launched several smart cities mission, there's urban development, there's a lot of development-oriented work that is happening. At the same time, over the last decade, India has seen probably its lowest point in terms of its humanitarian values. So, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but there is sort of a ground running through your talk that scientific progress in a way indicates a society's goodness, for lack of a better word. So how do you see this last decade in case of India, where we are touching absolute lows probably in India's history in terms of its status of human rights versus this scientific progress that is pretty much there. Nobody can contest that.
I'm speaking purely in terms of material wealth, material well-being. On that scale, India does okay. It does much better than Pakistan, but it doesn't do as well as China or even as Korea, and certainly nowhere close to Europe or the United States. So Indians shouldn't get too euphoric and Pakistanis shouldn't get too depressed.
I think there's something behind that question, which is that, you know, the irrationality that you're inveighing against is being encouraged in India these days by the current political situation. In other words, the scientific temper, or even scientists themselves, they may be very scientific in their lab, but they come out of the lab and then start spouting stuff which is extremely unscientific.
Yes, and now one wonders that if at the time of partition, it had not been Jawaharlal Nehru but Narendra Modi, could India have achieved what it did? It certainly would not have. The scientific temper is embedded into India's constitution. It has been the backbone on which has been constructed the IITs, the TIFR, the very good Indian institutions of learning. So certainly that way of thinking, that emphasis upon rationality has been critical to India's good performance. It's by no means excellent performance. India is mired in poverty. It is now mistreating its minorities. It's creating a kind of a national hysteria. And I'm very sorry to see it go this way, because there was a time when we deeply admired India for truthfulness of history, for the opportunities that it afforded to its religious minorities, and all that is now being defiled.
I just check if
We have 3 questions online.
Okay, so do you want to go first, Lopan?